So welcome everyone. My name is Rebecca Thiessen. I'm a professor here at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. I'm a co-director with Margaret Jenkins here to my left of the Gender, Peace and Development Research Network, which is part of the umbrella of the Center for International Policy Studies, our key partners for organizing this event today, and you'll see staff around helping us with that, along with the Research Network on Women, Peace, and Security, which is a national network of researchers, practitioners, and community members interested in women, peace, and security. So I'm delighted on behalf of those organizations, as well as our colleagues at Interpares, in particular, Amani Kalfani, who's joined us today too, who's been an extraordinary help in pulling everything together. I'll say some more things later. So it's very important, of course, for us to start with our Indigenous affirmation, and I will do that here, assuming the clicker works, or that clicker works. There we go. So this is the University of Ottawa's Indigenous affirmation, and I welcome you all today by beginning with the acknowledgement that this campus is on the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We cannot and we will not forget the harm that colonialism has caused and continues to cause for Indigenous people. So in the spirit of thinking of forgotten crises, we want to make sure that we acknowledge the important work that activists and community members are doing to raise awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in 2S. So as part of our reflections today on forgotten crises, we're also thinking about the many crises that have been ignored for too long, crises that have been caused by colonialism, including Canada's failure to prevent missing and murdered women and girls. There are important activities that are taking place that we can join and show our support. So we continue to learn and support Canada's commitments to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, to raise awareness about the National Inquiry Reports, and to follow the work of important organizations like the National Women's, National, the
Fusion of Native women.
Native Women, thank you. Um, Now, we know that there are many conflicts around the world, and we can't possibly address all of them today in the sort of depth that we may wish to do. That is why we have these cards in front of you, and there's some pens scattered throughout the tables. And we encourage you to write down a crisis that's on your mind, something that you think about, something that you're working to address. And you can write that crisis down on the card. At the end of the event, we're going to flip that card over and we're going to make a comment about our hopes or things that we're doing to raise awareness, support, work in allyship with colleagues. And then we'll hang it here on the feminist peace tree. It's a tool I've used at events before, so some of you may remember it. And hanging our hopes on this tree is symbolic of our hopes for how we can work together. So we know that these many conflicts and crises around the world can be overwhelming. Many countries and communities are embroiled in crises that result in prolonged and extensive suffering. Some crises get more attention than others, but we know there are people who continue to advocate for justice and the end of this suffering. So that's why we ask you to write down a crisis that comes to mind. Our panelists will share their insights or diverse crises and address these 3 points of examples of forgotten crises. So these are the 3 questions that will guide our event today. In terms of what do we need to know about some of these crises and their implications for women, peace, and security, and more broadly for marginalized community members, why these crises are forgotten, and what else receives insufficient attention within these crises? What else are we forgetting or is being forgotten? As well as the strategies of those extraordinary people, including our panelists today, who keep fighting for more attention to and resolution for these crises. So I'll now like to introduce our panelists. These are the collaborators for the event, as I mentioned earlier. Also, a shout out to the Women, Peace and Security Canada Network, the network of civil society organizations that played a very important role in sharing this event with many of you. So I'll now introduce our presenters. We have 6 presenters today. One is joining us online, Lindsay Forsland. Lindsay is a gender equality and peace building specialist with experience working on women's political participation and peace processes, democratic governance, security, and stabilization. She's worked for international nonprofit organizations and currently works for the United Nations Secretariat in New York as the deputy coordinator for the UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict. And Callum, do we confirm that Lindsay's with us? Great. Awesome. So we'll ask Lindsay to feel free to put her camera on and we'll pull you up on the screen. Over on my far right, we welcome Fahima Hashim, who is one of the founders of Salma Women's Resource Center. She's a professional whose experience includes over 2 decades of leading training workshops, campaigns, and research in feminist archive work focused on feminist movements and feminist movement building in Sudan. Thank you for joining us, Fahima. Next to Fahima, we have Sarah Anderson. She's the Gender Equality Advisor with Save the Children Canada, where she's worked for 6 years now. She manages a team of brilliant gender equality advisors and is responsible for the organization's gender equality portfolio and strategic initiatives. Next to Sarah, we have Wasma Frog, is a human rights lawyer and a peace building practitioner with over 25 years of frontline and policy level experience advancing gender equality, community resilience, and inclusive peace in Afghanistan and globally. She's the founder of Women and Peace Studies organization, WPSO Afghanistan, which supports local mediation efforts, conflict resolution, and women's engagement in community peace processes. And then we have Joe Rodriguez. Joe is a trainer and a consultant on women, peace, and security, as well as on equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, and conflict resolution. She's also a life, career, and leadership coach for humanitarian aid and international development workers. And I'm very grateful for both Joe and Wasma making the trip to Ottawa to join us in person today. Thank you both. And then we have Hillary. Hillary is a longtime human rights activist. Hillary Holmes is a longtime human rights activist who currently works for Amnesty International Canada as a crisis and tactical campaigner. And I had the pleasure of meeting Hillary at a meeting recently of the Canadian Civil Society Working Group on Sudan, one of the many things I know that they are involved in. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to everyone in the audience. We look forward to hearing from you. We will have a long question and answer and discussion period. We will invite you just to introduce yourself briefly. We have our name tags, but please just say a little bit about yourself. And let's hope this generates a really inspiring and productive discussion around the 3 themes of our panel discussion today. So without further ado, I will now turn to the first question for our panelists, and I have assigned 3 panelists to address the first 2 questions each, and we'll go in the order that we had planned for this event. So starting with the first question, what are some forgotten crises, and what are some of their implications for women, peace, and security? So I'll turn it over to you first, Wasma. There's a microphone near you there. We'll be sharing the microphone across the panel today.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Good morning, everyone. It's amazing. I see some people that I had seen in 2-3 years ago, but I know and they haven't changed much, so they still look very, very young women. But I couldn't remember your names. But it's lovely to be here again and seeing some of the friends that I know, and to start with the forgotten crises, and as somebody who works in Afghanistan right now, I think you all know that Afghanistan is one of the forgotten crises right now, and that's deliberately forgotten because, as you know, there was a NATO, US, Canada, and many other Western countries' involvement in Afghanistan for 20 years. There was an active war against the insurgency, the Taliban insurgency. But even then, we were like, while working on the ground, you know, our plea was that militarization would not address peace. Militarization would not bring peace. So we need to actually create stability, and we need to create environments where there is a better governance, so that insurgency can actually go away on its own, because it has many roots that we can address. But on that time, this war on terror was a very fancy, and the strategy of the US, as well as many of its allies, was very much around the war on terror. So what happened in 2020, they got tired, because they said, okay, we are failing, nothing is happening. So maybe, the Taliban continued, the insurgency continued to become stronger. There are suicide bombings every day. Provinces are being, controlled by the Taliban. So maybe we should just, turn our face and go home and find a way to call it peace. So then they started this peace deal that happened in Doha, and they completely sidelined women. And I remember, that time working in Afghanistan, continuously asking the ambassadors, the US, Canada, NATO, many of them, that, deal making is not about peace. You need to engage communities. You need to create that internal, environment for peace. Otherwise, this would be just a power sharing deal. But they were like, you know what, we will do the deal, and then when it comes to women's rights, then we will talk to you. So women's engagement and what do women are talking about peace became very much, a sideline, and that they never came. And then August 2021, the Taliban took over Afghanistan. And that was the time that 25 years of, progress that we had made. Millions of girls in schools, women in the universities, media, women businesses, just name it. Women in the police, women in the army, women in sports, for example. The Taliban started, a very gradual, not very overnight, but very gradual kind of relapse, and banning, creating bans and reversal of those rights for women. It started from schools, secondary schools, universities. You cannot have a gym. Women cannot go to parks. Women cannot go to work. Women cannot go to any public space. And right now, after 4 years, even the public activity for women is forbidden. But even if a woman is very sick and she has to go to the doctor and she's very ill, so the only way that she can go is to have a male accompany, and at the same time, somebody, she has to be completely covered in that, what I call the blue shuttlecock. It's it's a kind of a blue burqa that completely covers a woman. You don't even know what is behind that kind of, attire. That's what the Taliban are forcing women on. So why Afghanistan is a forgotten crisis? It's very much the strategy, right? Like it's not because of the importance of the crisis. So while the country is actually going through a very reversal of its rights, but at the same time there is a very, a national security issue. I don't want to kind of militarize the situation, because that's something that they have done and badly failed. But imagine when millions of people are not able to get education, but at the same time, when you have extremism taking so much roots in a society where younger boys, like 10, 11-year-old, are learning how to become suicide bombers, or learning how to fight, or learning how to actually, become extremists. That country, that society becomes very, very much, a safety, not just for its own, people, but also for people outside. Okay, my time is up, so I'll come back to the rest of my talking points. Thank you.
Could you pass the mic down to Matt, please?
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here and see some faces also that I've seen some time before. And thank you to Inter Paris for the invitation and Rebecca. And I just want to, I know it's like everybody knows how for the last 2.5 years, the conflict that's ongoing in Sudan. People are calling it a civil war, but I don't think it's a civil war. To me, it doesn't look like a civil war because it's not people fighting each other. It's two armies, like the militia and Sudan Forces Army are fighting for power with each other. They don't consider it about the people, so they are fighting to get more power among each other. The same time, the Sudan Army Forces and the militia, which is they call it RSF, they are both, I mean, two parts of the same coin. Like RSF was born out of the womb of the army, and the army used it as militia to attack Darfur in 2003. And I think maybe some of you know what happened in the last 20 years in Darfur and the genocide that happened in El Fasher itself, and now another genocide that's going on in El Fasher. What I want to say, despite all this, the war, what happened in El Fasher in the 25th of October, turned the war into into another point. And I think another genocide in 20 years that never happened in the world, as far as I know. So Al Fashir has faced two genocides in the last 23 years. What happened is now that just one sec. So the when the war started in Sudan, the international community just didn't really pay attention to what has been going on. Some of them said, Sudan is always a country with a lot of conflict, so what's new? And some of them said, oh, I don't think we need to open for humanitarian aid and all these kind of things. But then suddenly, when now we are seeing ourselves as the greatest, IDP crisis in the world, that 11 million and a half people have moved from their places because of lack of insecurity, and more than 4 million have fled to neighboring countries. So over 15 million people have fled Sudan, which is the total population is 45 million. And we don't even know the number of thousands of hundreds of deaths that has happened during this conflict. So there's no records, there's no more really accurate information about what's been happening. Of course, one of the things that I want to say, for the first time, for Khartoum has never been touched as a city, as the capital city, in these wars that is being going on in Sudan historically. But this is the first time in history that Khartoum was attacked, and people of Khartoum, who are around 8 million people, which represent around more than 20% of the Sudan population, had fled their homes. Their homes were robbed, and all their businesses have been taken. All their money have been stolen. Their cars, homes have been. So people don't have anything to go back to. Some of them are the first time in their life to leave their homes to go somewhere else, even out around Sudan itself. Some of them had multiple displacement because when they reach a state, and then the RSF will come into that state, they have to move to another state. So some people have really multiple, and with no economical support, because people really lost their businesses, their jobs, and most of them are depending on some of the families who are living in diaspora or in the Gulf area. I just want to tell you a small story, like with my family, where the area where we live, it's been actually an area was built by my great grandfather, and I think 125 years ago. Today it's empty. Homes have been occupied with other people. We don't know when, and my family and other people, my extended family will go back to this area. The house where I live is being built in 1925. So it's 100 years now. We lost all the things that we have, and it's now occupied by other families that they refuse even to leave the house, and they took everything that we have, been building throughout our generation after generation. When it comes to women, I mean, I just want to say violence against women has been a very much an structural thing by the state in Sudan. I mean, especially in the last 33 years since the Islamists came into power, when they made it more legalized and structured, like legal system and policies that really restricts women mobility, force of hijab and other things. And rape was even given a title in the security offices, that there is a guy who has a job called a rapist. That, I mean, that could happen to anybody, not only in conflict area. Conflict area was another dimension, because in Darfur in 2023, the way that rape was used as a weapon of war systematically to actually make more. I mean, even I mean, they were trying, because they were tribal issues there. They were trying to really tear or dismantle the social fabric of those communities, and each case happened in North Sudan, South Sudan, whatever has been going on in terms of conflict on violence against women. There's no accountability. And since the last 20 years or even more, there is no one has been held, as a perpetrator has been held accountable. So people feel that this is something that they could do and get away with, but they don't know how much they have been destroying life of those women. A story of two women, one mother and her daughter was 13 years old, and the mother in her mid 40s. They arrived to Cairo. Both of them were pregnant because both of them were raped in front of each other. And they came, we couldn't help them do abortion because pregnancy was already past 6 months. But they had, because of their risk of their life, there's nothing can be done. But the kidnapping now, and gang rape and slavery. Now, kidnapping, like the case of Al Fashir now, some of the women who tried to escape to go to Northern Sudan state, they're being kidnapped, and the most that they have to pay is around $3,000, and of course no one has money. And if you don't pay in 48 hours, you get killed. So that's what's been happening. Even yesterday, that the case of this woman, she was really, people were trying to really raise fund to pay the amount before the RSF will decide to kill her. So I mean, this is what has been happening in terms of, I mean, women have been trying to organize. There's a lot of work that has been going on, but I will leave that to strategies, maybe in the next question to answer. But now I think I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Any of you. Thank you so much for sharing and bringing in those examples, which are so important for us to be thinking about. And now we'll turn to Lindsay Forsland online, who is going to elaborate, I think, more on some of the things that you've shared with the work she's doing in her team globally. Welcome, Lindsay. Hopefully we'll be able to get you on the screen here. We have support in the room that's just pulling up the screen.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. It's great to be with you all, even if it's only virtually. And thank you so much for the invitation to be on this panel with so many exceptional colleagues doing really fantastic work. I just maybe wanted to zoom out a little bit and speak from the perspective where I'm sitting in the office of the Special Representative on conflict-related sexual violence. I think when we talk about forgotten crisis in the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, especially from within the perspective of the conflict-related sexual violence mandate, we're really describing so many contexts where violence has just been escalating at an exponential scale, but the political attention and the resources we're really finding are just evaporating before our eyes. Today, the CRSV mandate, we cover more than 21 situations of concern. And I really struggled to think about like how to identify within those 25 or 21 countries, you know, I can really say that almost every single one of them feels like they are at risk of becoming forgotten. and especially in this global funding crisis where there's more and more emphasis on spending on militarization and less resources, particularly for women who are on the front line. I mean, we're facing obviously the highest number of conflicts since the Second World War, and this kind of global turbulence is having just a profound impact on women and girls. Last year alone, from the perspective of our mandate, despite having enormous access constraints, the UN verified over 4,600 cases of conflict-related sexual violence. We say the UN verified because we have actually a very high threshold of verification for the Security Council, and this was already an 87% increase from 2022. But these statistics are a drop in the bucket compared to what we have reporting from, service providers and women's rights organizations in the field. And women and girls are making up over 92% of victims of these types of crimes. And we know that very few survivors, again, are even able to reach clinics or get any kind of support or services, and let alone, as Nazika was saying, eventually make it to a courtroom so that we can start addressing this issue from a justice standpoint. So it's an incredibly bleak time, I would say. Across these kind of forgotten crises, maybe I wanted to mention a few, since we were asked to kind of zoom in on some of these contexts. I think Nazika spoke very clearly about the context in Sudan. So maybe I was planning to say something about Sudan, but I think she covered very clearly, the systematic use of rape as a weapon of war, the abductions, the sexual slavery that's happening there. And again, this is a crisis where we see humanitarian actors just not reaching these vast areas, that impunity is absolute, and that women's civil society who have been on the front line are constantly being displaced and uprooted time and time again. So I think this is a textbook case of a crisis slipping out of global view precisely when women's protection needs are at their peak. Another context, which is very near and dear to my heart after working there for over 6 years, is the DRC. I think this is a chronic conflict where we've had chronic use of sexual violence, and we just see that resources have been shrinking with the peacekeeping mission drawing down there, but also from the humanitarian perspective. And I think this is a case where we have seen violence on the rise more and more, especially since M23 rise again, and the scale is staggering, but the service provision is just like minuscule there. So I think that women peace and security actors, women human rights defenders, are really left operating with a fraction of the budgets that they had just a few years ago, while violence is continuing. I also wanted to say something about Myanmar. Our team recently was on the ground in the region there, working very closely on a kind of action lab initiative with women human rights defenders, women who have been trying to document different atrocities, including conflict-related sexual violence. The sexual violence there is completely widespread. And I think the global community is in complete paralysis in terms of how to address the context of Myanmar. Yesterday, we also had our monthly focal point meeting where we bring together 27 UN agency funds and programs at the global level. And we had a briefing from our senior woman protection advisor in the region who works on Myanmar. We had our colleagues who organized the GBV-AOR, the Area of Responsibility to Respond to Conflict-Related Sexual Violence and other GBV issues from UNFPA, and we had the UN Women Rep on the line, and they all described how not only has the violence increased, but, and women human rights defenders are left with almost zero resources, but because of the duration now of the conflict, that these women human rights defenders are also facing extreme violence themselves, burnout. They're like also at risk physically during raids and checkpoints, and many of them are being held in detention. So women are disappearing, they're being killed after sexual violence, and torture is also being used. So I think political paralysis in this context, this crisis is receiving very little multilateral attention. And lastly, I wanted to mention Haiti, because I think perhaps for you in Canada, the escalating sexual violence and violence in Haiti is maybe in the news, but I would say on the global scale, there's almost no global focus on the situation in Haiti. And armed criminal groups, they're using rape, they're using sexual torture, they're using abduction and forced marriage and trafficking to consolidate their territorial control, to gain access to financial resources. Last year, we verified over 708 cases of conflict-related sexual violence, many of them being girls, and institutions there have completely collapsed. There is, again, very difficult access to services, and humanitarian actors are also being targeted. So I think I wanted to mention Haiti because I do think it's really important here, the role that Canada is playing in terms of keeping this issue on the agenda, and also not just keeping it focused on a military and a security response, but really trying to also advocate for the women, peace, and security agenda, gender considerations, the protection of women and girls, that aspect is not forgotten as the international community tries to, develop strategies for Haiti. I was in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago with the special representative, and we had an opportunity to speak to the State Secretary of International Development, as well as some colleagues in the peace operations team at Global Affairs Canada. And we have put forward a very concrete project proposal to the Canadian government to actually work on providing services to survivors of sexual violence, because what we've seen in the work that we've been doing in the office is like where survivors have resources, I think other parts of the women, peace, and security agenda can start to flourish, meaning that, survivors often also become advocates. They are often women human rights defenders. They're often providing services in their communities. And so they need basic protection, and, where they get protection, where they have access to economic resources, health, psychosocial support, they're able to participate in a peace building process. They're able to, ensure protection for their wider community. And I think that that's so critical that we don't forget in our humanitarian response the very small amount of humanitarian funding that we still have left to really focus our attention on these survivors. So I would just say, yeah, maybe a few other kind of not context specific, but across the 21 situations that we're looking at, some concerns are definitely, as I mentioned, that the sexual violence is becoming more brutal. It's more strategic. It's very deliberate because it's cheap and it's silent and it's effective because, as we've been talking about, there's very low risk when you have systems of total impunity. The impunity is entrenched. So over 70% of the parties that we list annually in the Secretary General's annual report have been perpetrating these crimes for 5 years or more. So when we talk about prevention, it's really difficult when you see the high levels of impunity. And as I mentioned, across those contexts, but we see it in all the contexts we're working, is like humanitarian and protection access is shrinking. So women human rights defenders, service providers, UN humanitarian colleagues, they're being attacked, or they have very restricted access. And I think the other thing is what's really shifting is we have a lot more criminal groups now, not just armed actors who are perpetrating these crimes, and using this as a weapon for territorial control in Haiti, Colombia, Myanmar. So we really need to think about expanding our WPS toolkit, I think, beyond kind of these traditional conflict actors. And of course, top of mind in terms of cost-cutting issues is the lack of funding for women rights organizations. They're just critically underfunded. We all know, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but they're the backbone of prevention, early warning, and support to survivors, and they're just receiving like not even a sliver of global financing. So I think when we talk about forgotten crisis, for me, we're not just referring to places that are falling out of the headlines. We're also referring to kind of a global hierarchy of attention here that really leaves women and girls off the agenda, and when we should be putting them at the center of our strategies for peace building. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. That was a really comprehensive overview and starting to touch on some of the things that we'll move to now. It's hard to let you know that your time is up. So I'm glad that you covered a lot of things early on, just in case the technology stops working, and we heard from you and got lots of rich insight. So let's move to the next question now. Question 2, if you could click that next for me. We're going to now reflect a little bit more, building on some of the things that our panelists have shared with us. What is being forgotten? What's being ignored? I know forgotten is a language that's increasingly being used in news articles at talking about some of these crises, but not perhaps the best word to really showcase what's happening. What do we need to be paying closer attention to? And why are some of these crises or aspects of these crises receiving so little attention? So, trying to unpack a little bit of what's going on, a deeper dive into the analysis of why these things are being forgotten. So, Joe, we'll turn to you next, followed by Hillary and then Sarah.
Hello. All right. Thank you very much for the invitation. I have to say, I come here today really with my friends in mind, the people who've been silenced, which is part of how you get to forgotten crises. I want to talk about like when I looked at this question, it was like, why are some crises forgotten and what else is forgotten as a result? And I'm going to speak to that last part first to contextualize my why. So what else is forgotten as a result of like limited focus on these crises? One, it's pretty obvious, but it's never really stated clearly, is human dignity. The other one is the climate change. So you don't address these things, the world is on fire and continues to be. It will get worse as a result of forgetting these crises. And the thing that makes us human stops existing if we ignore this, if we forget it. So when I talk about why are some crises forgotten, knowing that I had 3 to 5 minutes, I tried to bullet point this. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, why are crises forgotten? Language, privilege, power, racism. Language. When we talk about language, what you don't name, you can't address. I want to quote Omar El-Akkad. I say everybody's name wrong if it's not in English, and so my apologies for mispronouncing. He's a Palestinian Canadian author and journalist, and he talks about expression of power and privilege through the words we choose to use. He says, the privilege of describing a thing vaguely, incompetently, dishonestly is inseparable from the privilege of looking away. Words matter. When I last looked at the federal website, Canadian federal website on the stance on Gaza, it says that Canada is deeply alarmed by the worsening humanitarian crisis. It calls Gaza a terrible situation for the civilian population, and it says it's really, it's the humanitarian aid is quite restricted. What it's not saying is what is happening, which is genocide. So if you call something, it's a terrible situation, it's not really naming what the problem is, which is genocide, right? And this is the same situation when you talk about Sudan. You're not saying genocide. When you look at Afghanistan, we're not saying gender apartheid. We need to, if you don't name it correctly, if you're not clear in how you name things, you can't address it, right? But the problem with naming it that way is that it initiates moral obligation, right? The other part to moral obligation, though, is that you can ignore it because preserving privilege over others through the use of power is more important sometimes than addressing injustice and dehumanization. When we look at the media, they use unclear language. And why is that? Why do they use unclear language? We need to look at where their money comes from, who supports them, right? Sometimes the people who own these news places, they're constricted because they are muzzled. And so that's another thing to keep in mind when we think about why are conflicts forgotten. Genocide in particular is forgotten in Canada because if we were to name it as genocide, we would really have a reckoning with the genocide that we have done as a nation to the Indigenous people on this land. Like, you can't say genocide about Gaza and Sudan and not recognize your accountability to the genocide that's happened and continues to happen. It's not up for debate. It continues. So, to preserve your power, you need money. Economies thrive on selling goods like arms and extracting valuable resources for sale. Crises are forgotten when there's no economic gain. Crises are forgotten because of dehumanization and racism. And again, these are not things we're hearing specifically, clearly named. And as a result, it's easy to forget, ignore, just, there are different ways to turn a blind eye to what's happening. Am I okay to talk about what should be done more of?
What we need to do more of.
Yeah, or is that a different question? So I think like where I want to end on this is, I think when we think about forgotten crises, we need to look at these themes a little bit more, the language, the racism, the power, and the privilege. And we need to deal with uncomfortable truths. It's easy for someone like myself right now to say this to you in this, normal, relaxed way, because I've taken hours of my life I'll never get back to bullet point this. However, there are people who are genuinely angry and have a reason to be angry. And they shouldn't have to sit down for hours to bullet point something for us to be able to look at them and go, yes, we have a problem and we need to do something about it. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Just jump in. That was awesome. That was so I'm going to try to do a bit of a companion to that in the sense of looking at some of the other really structural things. As the other people on the panel have already sort of noted, when that kind of chronic crisis, so a situation that's already marked by human rights and humanitarian law violations is continuing out of the spotlight, that's the breeding ground for that becoming chronic, for further atrocities. Forces are going to pursue their goals of power and control and exploitation with impunity. And allies will continue those supply lines, including the arms. And that cycle of violence won't be broken. And so solidarity in this context will be really challenging because, it puts people at greater risk, especially if they're trying to raise up voices, shed light, and draw attention. So, crises are forgotten often because that's what people in power want, whether it's around use of language or the things they are doing structurally. Borders are closed or heavily controlled. Internet and mobile phone service shutdowns are a really common technique now. Foreign journalists are turned away, or you have to be embedded if you want to go anywhere. local independent media, human rights defenders, critics, anybody trying to raise up a voice, they're targeted, arrested, shut down, killed. There's no cooperation with international investigations. In fact, there's moves now to introduce sanctions and disinformation to undermine those very efforts. And if you do escape and you're trying to tell your story, you may be subject to transnational repression. So you think of situations like Xinjiang in China, and we used to hear about the detention camps, not so much anymore. The whole list down the table and on the screen, I could reassert that. The media landscape is worth being looked at very closely. The issue of language and muzzling is part of it. How it is actually structured now, though, is another place we need to look at. Everyone's cutting costs. There's fewer and fewer international bureaus. Mainstream media organizations often have reporters working from a continent away. If someone's reporting on Afghanistan from London, and you're thinking, really, how do you know? Or they fly in and out and they capture sort of moments. And the more kind of extreme and sensational, like that's how that moment is cast. And it's the only reason it's being covered. And you really lose the understanding. The use of language becomes very dehumanizing in those contexts. And what this really should have done, so yeah, cutbacks. We're all facing cutbacks. What it should have done is open the door to enhance media partnerships and reporting from local journalists, the people who know those contexts well, who have the use of language down pat. But racism, right? Colonial attitudes persist around who's recognized as a legitimate voice, and who's objective. We continue to face that reality that if you're local on the ground and reporting, you must be biased somehow. There's this sort of magical idea of objectivity that's supposed to be guiding our work, that it's garbage, and then there are also efforts put into undermining those local media voices. Think about the context of Gaza and the line being used by Israel. They're not journalists, they're all Hamas. You can't trust them. In fact, that's why we're targeting and killing them. And but without Palestinian citizen journalists and the freelancers, the sort of nameless freelancers that a lot of media outlets are using, think about, because you usually just see their images, you don't hear their voices. But think about what you would really know about what's happening in the genocide without those people risking their lives and largely remaining nameless. It would be there's an attempt to have, anyway. That's a whole panel, right? That's a day, that's a week, that's so much. Read Omar Alakad's book. It's marvelous. I think the last thing I want to touch on, and it is kind of the harsh reality of where we're at, is we're part of the problem. So, we and I mean like the campaigning organization, the research and campaigning organizations like Amnesty and others, that broader social justice community, we lose people. So we lose people, we lose funding, we lose other resources on that last sort of leg of the journey towards justice. Or simply because a conflict has become chronic. It's become a long-term crisis. People like to see results, right? You know what I'm talking about. That's whether my friend down the panel is nodding. So, whether they're donors or supporters or fellow activists or coalition partners, organizational leaders, all the people we're accountable to, they want to see results. We have to fill out endless forms around that sort of thing as well. I know people who've applied for grants, know what I'm talking about. So a change in the situation, whether that's sort of a fragile ceasefire, a very dubious peace plan that didn't involve the most directly affected people, you know what I'm talking about there. Any regime change, often that's declared a victory in and of itself. There'll be a stay of execution, someone's released. Any change, you're seeing a positive step. There's relief, there's celebration, and there's this kind of declaration of, well, the main crisis is over. Even when you haven't addressed the rest. So the risk of there being a new or ongoing abuse looms. No one's being held accountable, but people move on. We did that campaign on fill in the blank, right? What's next? Give me something new. I'll be saying a bit more about that in the answer to the last question, but there's a reason why we chant like no justice, no peace. There's a real reason for that. It's hard work to keep the perpetrators accountable. It's essential work. We have to do that. But fewer people sort of stay with us, and that's one of the reasons why the cycle of impunity continues.
Joe and Hillary for those comments. I'll turn now to Sarah to add some final comments, but I want to give an opportunity after you speak, Sarah, if you wanted to jump in, Wasma or Fahima, just to add a little bit more on this piece too. Please, Sarah.
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca. So before I start, I'm just going to say I have a cold, so please bear with me. I have sanitized. I'm going to try not to make you sick with the mic. But thank you all. It's such an honor and a privilege to be here, especially among these panelists and hearing all of the amazing work that you do. It is not easy. You're hearing the stories, but it's not easy hearing them day in and day out and working on this. So I appreciate you and I respect you and I thank you. So what I want to talk about today is shifting us a little bit. So in addition to what's already been shared, for me, what's truly forgotten are the rights and voices of women and girls. So I work for a child rights organization. So today I'm going to be talking about adolescent girls. So when attention fades, as we've talked about with media and political will, regression begins or increases and rights roll back. This is what we have seen and heard from our colleagues here today. In conflict, harmful and discriminatory norms intensify, including child early and forced marriage, sexual violence, and child recruitment. Historically, girls have been least represented, are often the most impacted, yet unintentionally they remain unheard. Given the intersections of age and gender, they are often treated as expendable, given in marriage or recruited into armed groups. They also remain structurally excluded. Customary courts and local mediation systems remain male-dominated. So similar to women, as we know, girls have no seat at these tables, even though these decisions deeply affect their lives, both today and in the future. But when we look at the Women, Peace, and Security framework, adolescent girls are often overlooked there as well, often. So if we look at the UN SCR 1325 and subsequent Women, Peace, and Security resolutions, they acknowledge women and girls as disproportionately affected by conflict, but implementation often focuses on adult women. Adolescent girls' unique needs and roles are rarely addressed or explicitly. Women, Peace, and Security initiatives tend to default to older women's leadership, while youth, peace, and security often focus on young men, leaving adolescent girls at the margins of both agendas, which are both very important agendas. Global frameworks like the Vancouver Principles focus on the prevention of the recruitment of child soldiers. They do acknowledge women, mostly in terms of peacekeepers, yet they fail to recognize adolescent girls as right holders and agents of change. Their roles, needs, and vulnerabilities remain absent from peacekeeping and peace-building discourse. So why does this inclusion matter? So globally, there are 600 million adolescent girls, with about 500 million of them residing in lower income or developing countries, many in conflict-affected regions. Their experiences differ from younger children, but also from adult women. This is why we have to have gender and age-sensitive approaches to our work. Enhancing adolescent girls' empowerment helps to build their agency, reduces vulnerability to recruitment and exploitation, and contributes to long-term peace and economic stability, as you all know. Yet the gaps remain. Global processes lack accountability mechanisms to meaningfully integrate or include adolescent girls. Many girls, and the investments are the same. Many of the investments in girls are not reaching girls directly. Education remains a major gap, as you all know. So adolescent girls in conflict settings are 2.5 times more likely to be out of school than boys, increasing risk of early marriage and recruitment into armed groups. According to Save the Children's 2024 Global Girlhood Report, more than half of the countries with the highest rates of child marriage are in countries that are considered fragile. And the way our report describes fragile context is often driven by crises like conflict, climate disasters, or economic shocks that increase common risks of child marriage. So what are some current efforts? As part of Save the Children's current project on community responsive peacekeeping in Somalia and South Sudan, this is funded by Global Affairs Canada and their Peace and Operations Department. The teams on the ground in both countries recently hosted gender and youth workshops, which explored the role of women and adolescent girls, but also youth, and boys in preventing child recruitment into armed groups. So really consulting with them. What is happening? What are the risks? What are you seeing? What does the reintegration look like? So hearing from them on the ground directly. So these level of community consultations with boys, girls, women, and men in South Sudan and Somalia are the first ever, from my knowledge anyways, Vancouver principal engagements with communities, because typically the consultations typically focus on peacekeepers or government or policymakers versus, as was mentioned, consulting with communities on the ground. These consultations taught us about the risks that adolescent girls face for recruitment and expectations for them once they're in the armed groups. So including the initiation and expectation of a violent act committed by the girls themselves. Also, to the extent the sexual abuse that they endure, the long-term mental health consequences that they grapple with while in the armed groups and if they get out, and also the stigma that they face once they're reintegrated. And I'm going to put that in quotation marks, because once they're reintegrated with their communities and families, it's not always a smooth sailing from there. We heard in South Sudan an example. We were told that children should have their father's last names. Yet when these girls return home, they may not know the last name of the father of their child, or they simply may not wish to give their child that name for understandable reasons. This can further stigmatize them and their children and their families and also their communities. In Somalia, one adolescent girl told us, "I hope to get peace in the world, but I also hope to get personal peace." These aspirations rarely shape policy. So when crises are forgotten, adolescent girls are doubly forgotten. First as victims, then as survivors, then as potential leaders in peace building, and we must change that. So I'll stop there.
And thanks also for making the connection to the next question, which will be focusing on some of the amazing work that is being done. But Wasma, I wanted you to have a chance to speak to some of this question as well around the why.
Thank you. I want to mention that, you know, while we are talking about how women are impacted, women and girls particularly, but in many times how they are also dealing with situations and how they are like managing those crises, that also gets forgotten. So for example, right now I work with 300 women in Afghanistan in different provinces, and each of them work with around 700 other women. So literally we are in contact with 1,000 women in different parts of Afghanistan. They have turned their living rooms into classrooms. They are doing home-based businesses, for example. They are teaching our little girls. They are doing group healing and psychosocial programs inside their homes. They are doing so many different activities, and they are also documenting the Taliban human rights violations. But so all of this work is being done, and these women are like, they don't speak English, but they understand WPS much better than myself. So when they explain, for example, when they go to the UN, for example, when they talk to the UN about, like, let's say, a UN Secretary General's representative or the head of UNAMA goes to the province to talk to women. And the women come there and they talk about the issue of, for example, women's participation in the local government. And then the UN representative tells, "Oh, I'm here for a discussion on humanitarian issues, not on women's rights." So, and these women have been so furious that how can you detach that gender lens from humanitarian crises itself is very much gendered. The poverty, but at the same time, these women are managing microeconomies at home. They have created these informal networks of food distribution. One woman who has like eggs, she is trading it for milk with another woman, so that, or for example, another woman is getting wheat from this woman. That's how they're helping other women in the community from starvation and children who don't have anything to eat. So they are trying to help. But when it comes to the aid, for example, how blind it has turned, and in many conversations, for example, with the donors, when I say that, oh, we are trying, from a WPS lens, and they are saying, oh, WPS is relevant in Afghanistan anymore, because that is not something we are dealing with humanitarian crisis right now. So that's also an area where how much resilience and how much strength these women are showing on the ground. Yes, you don't hear them in New York Times, you don't hear them in the international media, because as we talked about, it's not very fancy, it's not interesting for the media. And in a country like Afghanistan, where like a whole governance model is based on gender apartheid, there's a slow motion of women, of crises on women or severing rights on women. Like you don't see it, but it's happening over time very much. So you don't hear it in the media. Like it's this past whole week, the women in Herat province in the western part of the country are fighting burqa enforcement, where if you're a female doctor and doing a delivery, you have to be in the burqa. That's the new rule from the Taliban. If you are, for example, examining a patient, you have to be in complete blue burqa. And the female doctors have been fighting it, the nurses have been fighting it. But nobody never heard about it in the media, right? Because it's not interesting for people outside, and it doesn't. So I'm also want to mention that how much of the aid, and the humanitarian language from the international community, particularly the UN, has normalized, the situation on the grounds, where they turn a blind eye to all the apartheid, for example, in Afghanistan, or how the Taliban are taking away women's rights. The other thing I also want to mention is about how much the work of the women impacted on documentation of human rights violation of the Taliban. Right now, we have an ICC case, for example, where two of the Taliban leaders, there's an arrest warrant issued for them, but we don't hear what happened to it. We keep asking for it. We keep pushing for it. Canada, together with 4 other countries, is part of a case against the Taliban at the International Court of Justice. We continue to push for it, but we don't hear what's happening. And under this guise of confidentiality, you don't hear anything about it. But it's again the women who are like turning into humanitarian workers. They are turning into peace workers. They're turning into all these different roles, and we don't hear that. And we all have been kind of victimized, and oh yes, the women are victims, but no, they are also making so much change. Yeah, they don't have the guns, so maybe the last thing that is left for women to take up guns, so maybe that would help them to be noticed. That's what I hear from so many women on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the war in Afghanistan has a longer time than the war of Sudan now, to look at its impacts but I have 2 things that I feel that I've forgotten, with how women have been able to shift the lives of their families and the elderly and their children after the war, where the men refused to leave Sudan. Women who left not only the states they were in to go into a safer space or going to another country. This was women, decisions were taken by women. They were able to, for example, so these women known for having gold as part of their, when they wear it, but they used that to really maintain their economic lives in order to some of them were able to also do some small businesses in Uganda, in Kenya, in Egypt, and when their husbands felt that they have to come because it was so insecure. When they reached there, they found their parents, their husband's parents, and her parents, and the children are all eating well and in living in an apartment, and those women are maintaining this life. But no one is really talking about how women have created this economic shift on the lives of I'm just talking about the case of Egypt, because maybe also I'm talking about some privileged families, but some other families were able also, who even went to Eastern Sudan, were able to use some of their skills in order to create small businesses. And even young girls who opening like a salon, for example, helping with other women, and then they don't need to go and ask for money to survive wherever they are. So women were the one who took this decision and took this responsibility more than the men. The men felt and I think this is one of the things that maybe we need to tackle later. Men felt for the first time, maybe where patriarchy is a little bit having some problems in Sudan, that men felt they don't have power because they lost their businesses, they lost their jobs, so they don't have control over the finance of the family. And when I remember in Cairo when we were talking about this women entrepreneurship and how they have been learning in order to improve their packaging, improve their sell online, because in Egypt is much more improved. I mean, better than in Sudan. So they were trying to really learn new skills and see how they could do that. Men were not able to do anything. And there's a man I remember in one panel we had, he said, I think I want to admit that you people are right. I came 3 months or 6 months after my family moved, and I'm just lying there. I don't know how how to do anything. I don't know how I will be doing it. I just felt like since I lost my job or I lost the business I was doing, I'm just so confused. And I think it's another thing that we want. I mean, they wanted to talk about it, but of course, the overwhelming situation of women is not giving them that chance. Another thing I think is also not really given attention in Sudan is there's a lot of false information. It's being paid to, social media, even the news, the YouTubes, and there's a lot of money going into this false information. And there's another organization now working to make this false information right. So that we're wasting money in between these two. So, and then the mention of, I think it was just one point that I want to mention here is when this American government mentioned yesterday or the day before yesterday, no, it's, yeah, yesterday, that the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, when he mentioned for the first time sexual violence as being committed in Sudan and has to be pay attention to that, and also he mentioned to stop providing weapons to RSF, and it was, I think, for me, mentioning women, violence against women in by this voice, it's very important. We need to, how could we take it from there? Thank you so much.
Thank you. We can keep the mic with you, Fahima, because we'll come back to you and we'll just come down the table now for the third question. But, a number of you have talked about this, and I think it's really important for us to start also to reflect on the invisibilization of women, peace, and security in a lot of the rhetoric. So we've got, this example of Secretary of State Rubio saying, that we need to focus on this. But at the same time, we also have NATO, for example, that is moving away from using the language of women and pushing for a language of humanitarian assistance or human development. And so there's this, we have to now fight even just to keep WPS in these spaces, to keep it part of the conversations. And it is something I'm sure many of you are continuing to push for. So I invite you now to share some of the strategies and actions, the work that you're doing, the things that you're observing that are contributing to the positive changes that we want to see, pushing back against some of the pushback, for example. So we'll start with you, Fahima, and then we'll just come down the table.
I just want to do a flashback because in 2014, the British government organized this women sexual violence in conflict with, I think the form was the William Hague and Angelina Jolie were on the face of their conference in London, and then we had, so many people were there, and talking about same things that we're talking about now. I'm just thinking it's like we don't. I sometimes you get worse, it doesn't get changed, and we can't even complain or feel tired of doing it, even without seeing the results out of that. So and working in Sudan at that time, when I spoke in this conference, when I went back to Sudan, our organization was foreclosed by the government because they said that we are doing so much of dismantling the Islamist project. I don't know how that is me attending a conference or talking about violence against women or violence in conflict. But anyway, that what happened actually. Okay, one of the things that I want to say that's really been a very important work that I was doing in June 2023, we myself and another 4 or 5 women who are being connected with different organizations, with being connected by Black Feminist Fund to fundraise for Sudan. I coordinated this work, and through this program, and I think it was called uh, Black Feminist Action for Sudan, where Black feminists called for all Black feminists in all feminist funding organization, and they made an initiative to raise around $2 million to support emergency support Sudan organization and women work. Until now, this work has reached a 1.6, hoping that they are planning by the end of this year, even though it's very short, but they will close it to 2 million, which was the initiative that was planned by Black Feminist Initiative. This work has been very important to really not going through difficult, complicated proposal writing or reaching, donors rules and regulations. It was money that put, and then we did the mapping of who's working in what, and who is working in Sudan, who is working in Kampala IDP refugees camp, who is working in many places. The focus was mainly in Sudan inside, especially the other thing that which was a very great strategy was Sudan have formed the emergency rooms immediately after the war, and the emergency rooms was helping everybody in the community. But the feminist emergency room, which was part of that, become more relevant to really look at pregnant women, postnatal, antenatal, providing counseling, providing food, providing even jobs for some of the women in the community. And in Khartoum itself, there were around 40 feminist emergency rooms. And then all the secure state have formed, including therefore South Kordofan, North Kordofan. These emergency rooms were in top of priority of this funding. And the funding was actually, we did create, because to fund Sudan through these channels, because the money is coming from the US, it's coming from Europe, we also tried to look at conduits who will be fiscal sponsors and, receive this money and then disperse the money to the people who are in Sudan. We managed to give over 40 organizations, and now with until the end of the funding. So some of them already taken this, and usually the fund between $20 to $40,000. Another thing that I want to mention is the work that we were doing also on feminist leadership using what we call a feminist risk assessment, because that was more into building solidarity with the women who are working in Sudan, mentor them, coming back to them, not feeling alone, that they are the people outside are really recognizing the work they are doing. I feel the most important part of this is what do we need to do next? What do we expect from this present? I mean, this session. What are we trying to get out of this? For example, I'm just giving an example of the Australian government making this kind of relocation of women survivor of violence, or in Sudan and South Sudan for women at risk, they call it. It's a visa. They relocate women who have been at risk to Australia. And I think this is also another pathway Canada has been using. And another thing that I feel that's also possible working on humanitarian, keep us in the loop, not to forget about what's going on, but also how could we, how Canada provided issues of women, peace, and security. How are we going to strengthen that and make a plan and have more a collective work rather than just being isolated and being working alone? Thank you.
Yeah, those themes of consultation, collaboration, and funding are so important. Yeah, over to you, Sarah. We won't forget you, Lindsay, online. You'll have a chance. We'll ask you at the end of the panel.
Great.
Sure, thanks,
Thank
Rebecca.
you.
So for me, what are we doing or what can we do? What can change? So there needs to be a paradigm shift. You already told me talk about, we're talking about what's forgotten and who's forgotten in these crises. So we've talked a lot about women, but as I've said, we also cannot forget about adolescent girls, given the experiences that they have, the targeting of them and the impact and what they're experiencing, but also hearing their ideas for the future, their solutions, because they have them. We just need to listen to them and engage with them. So in terms of advocacy priorities, I would say that we should be demanding that women, peace, and security funding explicitly include women and girls, particularly adolescent girls, not as a courtesy, but as essential actors, creating intergenerational leadership spaces and dialogues between them. Adolescent girls must be centered as co-architects of reintegration and peace processes, including prevention and response. Investments are needed for sustainable and gender responsive reintegration for children affected by armed conflict, understanding and meeting the different needs of adolescent girls and boys. So like I've said, we have a project that's focusing on the prevention of the recruitment of child soldiers, and it's been even difficult to get gender included in there to realize and understand how girls are being, what their risks are, and then how they're being impacted as well. So having tailored interventions to meet the needs of both. Because release without reintegration perpetuates cycles of recruitment for boys and girls, ongoing stigmatization, and re-traumatization. We must amplify adolescent girls' voices, especially those connected through social media and advocacy networks. This is coming from my colleagues in Somalia, so they can shape solutions, not just endure the consequences. Save the Children has long recognized that lasting change for girls requires both robust legal frameworks and empowered local voices. Working closely with national institutions, but as well as local partners, Save the Children continues to advocate for the adoption and implementation of gender-based violence and child rights laws or policies that provide the legal foundation for girls to claim justice, safety, and empowerment or equality. Through initiatives such as the Changes Project. So Changes is an acronym, it's a mouthful as a title. It's changing harmful attitudes and norms for gender equality empowerment in Somalia. This is a project that was funded by Global Affairs Canada that ended earlier this year, focused on child early and forced marriage and female genital mutilation and cutting. But through this project, we partnered with national women and girls' rights organizations in Somalia to mentor and equip adolescent girls with advocacy, leadership, and negotiation skills, supporting them to become influential advocates within their communities. These efforts demonstrate that when girls have access to knowledge, networks, and platforms for engagement, they emerge as powerful agents of social transformation. Save the Children and our women and girls' rights organization partners effectively bridge the gap between grassroots activism and institutional decision-making, ensuring that Somali girls' voices are represented where policies are shaped. Looking ahead, it is critical to move beyond consultation towards a co-leadership model. So not just a token, as we've heard from girls around the world, that when it comes to certain days, like the International Day of the Girl, they're consulted and then that's it. They're never reached out to again. They're not included in processes. So moving beyond just consultation towards co-leadership. Girls must be given the financial and political power to lead, and the proven advocacy models led by my colleagues, particularly Save the Children of Somalia, and its partners should be institutionalized. This means systemically linking girl-led empowerment spaces with formal political and accountability mechanisms, such as we've done in Somalia. And by we, I mean my incredible colleagues who are Somali and based in Somalia. Ensuring that girls are not only heard, but actively shaping the future and their communities and their nation. So a few key takeaways, if I wanted to conclude, if anybody wants to take notes. There is strong evidence and advocacy momentum to argue that adolescent girls are the missing link within the women, peace, and security implementation. We need to center girls as co-architects, as I've said before, of prevention and reintegration systems that work for them, nothing without them. Policy silos such as women, peace and security and youth peace and security perpetuate exclusion, not intentionally, right? These things never usually happen. They can happen intentionally, but oftentimes they're not. So we need to make sure that their age and gender intersectionality must be addressed. Investing in adolescent girls is not charity. It's a long-term peace-building strategy. If we want lasting peace, we must stop thinking of girls as victims in some corner far off in the world and start seeing them as leaders at the center of the women, peace, and security agenda, along with women. Thank you.
Over to you, Asma.
Thank you. You know, my grandmother used to say that if the oppressor will only be stronger when the oppressed thinks that I cannot do anything about it. What I have seen in the past couple of years or more, actually, that the international advocacy for particularly for international justice and accountability has really kind of, you know, become like ghettoized, very weakened in many like spots. Yes, funding cuts has impacted it, but we have, and I see that there's also the language co-opted many times, because just because it puts people, you know, in danger, or maybe we are just worried that one president somewhere is putting sanctions on ICC, so nobody can talk about ICC. This is the time that we need to strengthen the ICC. We need to stand in support of ICC, the International Court of Criminal Court, for example. So the international advocacy, having been in this space for the past 25 years of my life, I found more times stronger than what we are in currently. I feel that we have really kind of been oppressed and kind of pushed back, but we need to bounce back. And that's where I think we need to raise our voices stronger. Because what is happening on the ground, what's happening in these conflicts, that women are not victims anymore. They have learned skills. They have actually created a lot of mechanisms for themselves. They are peace builders. These women are peace builders on the ground. So we have to fight the militarization. All this money that goes into the arms and militarization, we have to stand up against that. Otherwise, you know, it's like somebody is having a cancer and we are trying to actually put nail polish into that person. Sorry for my kind of, you know, the comparisons, but that's how I see it. The small projects and short-term, you know, impacts are not going to make any difference unless we have an international language that we can stand for. Because when we think on the ground, things are like, I find women in Afghanistan much more courageous than me. Like, you know, they are talking about genocide, they are talking about gender apartheid in a much stronger language than I can do in Canada, for example. And I find myself at times censoring myself because, oh, I don't want to lose this funding, or I don't want to make this friend sad, or I don't want my immigration case to be impacted, right? So all of that, but so we have to name it. That you mentioned that. So naming it and standing for it is so critical. Funding is important, yes, but I also see that like the international justice and accountability mechanisms, that's a one kind of area that we need to fight, because there will not be any peace without justice. So like, and we saw that in Afghanistan. So I want to say that Afghanistan is like a stress test for WPS agenda. If we can't do, you know, for 20 years, we had so much of progress, a national action plan, a lot of changes in the life of women. But then suddenly there was an international peace deal that said, you know what? This war has been so long and we are so tired of it. We failed, so let's turn our faces. And now hand over the country to the Taliban, which is like an extremist or terrorist group that have made life worse for women, and they have been using gender apartheid as a governance model. So I want to say that women on the ground are doing so much already that we don't even hear about it. We need to strengthen ourselves internationally and become a bit more courageous. Thank you.
Holy cow. I mean, we need people like on this panel to keep doing the fight. Okay, I wrote a question, I wrote a note here to myself, and I've been scratching out the last word. So the first question was, what will make you hear? Then I scribbled out here, what will make you care? I scribbled out care. What will make you act? Okay, what do we need to do more of? First, I want to root my answer in Indigenous pedagogy. One of the things that, the teachings from different Indigenous nations is about the 7 generations, right? What you do now impacts 7 generations ahead, right? So please bear that in mind as I'm sharing my suggestions about what we can do more of, right? First thing, stop talking about consultations and start talking about collaboration, right? I love, I'm sorry, Sarah. I love what Sarah said about, having co-architects. So I think, again, look at the language we're using, even when it comes to like, how do we start working on the problems to be like solved, and how do we do that? The other thing I want to say, this is like a very practical thing. Like, I hope organizations who have the bandwidth to do this, please do it. Make it easy and make it automatic. So what happened when USAID went down the toilet at the beginning of the year is that Americans on the ground and overseas were they were sending emails to their elected officials, and it was like on repeat. So it was a very short message, and it was time to go out every single day at a particular time. I think what would really help galvanize regular people who are trying to like pay their mortgages and try to get the kids to school and like all of that is make it easy and make it automatic. Support them in flooding MPs, because like when we say what will make you care or what will make you act as MPs is when you know that you're going to lose your vote and you're going to lose your seat. So that's like a practical note. I want to talk about also implement recommendations. I mean, there was just a new one that came out yesterday, sent to me by a colleague from the Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. And the report is called The Toll of Intent. I highly recommend that you look at it. This is unfortunately, again, it's telling the recommendations are there and they will be ignored. So if you really want to do more, just do what it says. I don't know, like, I remember an Indigenous colleague years ago at one of these events where the federal government was like, I don't know why I'm here. There are decades of these recommendations that you still haven't implemented. I don't know why I'm here. And really what that comes down to is the yes, but, right? We need to stop saying yes, but, and we need to actually speak to what's the underlying, like the root of the problem, right? And I understand that by saying, like, if we were to actually get to the root of the problem, if we were going to actually speak to that, that some organizations could lose funding, right? I'm speaking real because we don't have time because people are dying unnecessarily, right? So if you're going to lose funding and you just say, like, I can't take a stand on genocide. You know what? There's so many of activists who are tired of like listening to people who say, or organizations say, I will help you. And then they have this language conversation and the thing but we can't say this and we can't do that, but we still want your opinion. Can you please just support some people by not lying to them and just say, I'm sorry, I can't take a stand on genocide, but this is what I can do in my small particular niche. And that would be so welcome. That would be so welcome, right? Because then we can focus on like the other organizations or people or whatever that can take that stand on genocide, and your support is still welcome. But please don't mislead people, because it's hurting people's hearts. And these are people who have nothing to lose. The other thing I wanted to say is, I want to share a quote with you, again from Omar El-Kad, and I think this like really hits home to what I've just said. He said, for some, the worst plausible thing might be the end of their bloodline in a missile strike, and for others, the worst possible thing is being yelled at. All right, three things. I'm going to be quick. Ask better questions. I think one thing that is really driving me personally nuts is when we give the floor to the federal government or whatever, like whoever is in power, and say, you know, what can you do to address this? And it just gives them the space to give their lines of like help with a ceasefire, give humanitarian aid, whatever, but not talk about the real problems. And so we need to create the spaces, and we need to have allies to ask questions like, what specific steps are you taking to stop sending arms to Israel? What legal and on-the-ground steps are you taking to seek justice for Palestinians facing ethnic cleansing in Gaza and the West Bank? What specific steps are you taking to stop the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia that are being used to kill Yemenis? And what are the ways you are leveraging pressure on the Taliban to respect and protect the rights of women and girls, end gender persecution, and enable space for women's meaningful participation in social, political, and cultural spheres? Those are the kinds of questions we should be asking, not questions that allow the government to pretend that they are intentional about stopping genocide, for example. Diversify funding sources. I spoke to lovely people also working on this stuff just last night, and there are answers to diversified funding. So it's not a thing of like, we don't have, I mean, I know it's that we don't have funding, and I know it's hard to get funding, but let's pool our resources and our efforts together to diversify, because it's not working the way it is right now. People are dying as a result of cuts to funding. And ensure, this is actually like what I read from Miriam Anderson, who works at the Toronto Metropolitan University, and she published something recently at the London School of Economics. And she talked about ensure robust and diverse women's voices, right? And when we talk about robust women's voices, this doesn't mean one person at the mediation for the whatever. It means making sure a conversation doesn't happen without a diversified voice of women at the tables, where you can't leave until and unless their words and recommendations are in the final document that is to be committed to implementation. The end.
So I'll be the annex to that. Yeah, I mean, I've spent a life as a campaigner, and that is my perspective on this one. And part of me is reassured to hear make it easy and automatic, because I write a lot of online actions. And, you know, often when you work for an organization like Amnesty, like that, to a certain sector of the public, that's how they measure what you've prioritized. Do you have an online action on it? Don't really care about the rest of what you're doing, but, you know, is there something I can sign? And so I know those are a really helpful starting point for people, but they're not an end in themselves. You need to have that easy and automatic. You need to have the depth of campaigning, and you need to reward repetition and persistence. And we need to do all that. You know, it's I made reference earlier to the sort of, yeah, I did that, what's next? And I'm like, do it again. You can take that action more than once. In fact, you must, right? And I think we need to get a bit better at that. We need to be better at everything all the time, it seems. But I mean, the big sort of question is like, how do we get people in for the long haul? And, you know, getting them into that sort of theory of change. I think there's a number of kind of avenues for that. One is that, you know, working in coalition, having a panel with, I mean, this is great, 6 people. I'm on so many panels where they're like 2 or 3, but you need all these perspectives, or you don't understand the problem. You don't get the richness of the discussion. You don't get an intersectional approach. You don't get that collective sort of solidarity and strategy and so on. One of the things I'm going to zero in on is just, and it's kind of top of mind for me, that I was tuning into one of the parliamentary hearings on Sudan, and a particular, it was the Subcommittee on International Human Rights. I don't know how many people follow the parliamentary process, but you know, they do studies on this and that, and they line up a bunch of witnesses, and they have a report at the end. And it's really frustrating. Like the hearing I was watching, I guess there was a technical reason why the representative of the Sudanese Canadian community could not be part of the hearing. So it's just the other people, and wow, it took some strange turns. And it really illustrates, like, if you do not lift up rights holders and effective communities in what you're doing, then what are you doing? And, you know, I think we really need to lean on parliamentarians to find a way to get beyond the very partisan nature of what's going on, because you watch a hearing like this and you're like, what are you really doing? You're just playing out your party politics using these witnesses. And stop it, you know? And it really has to come from our organizations and communities to change that. You know, they will pick one voice, whether it's like one woman or one person from a community, and say, okay, yeah, we've had that community at the table. We're now going to hear from these other experts. And often there's kind of a colonial approach to that still. And we really need to lean on them to say, no, multiple voices. Communities are not homogenous. You can't just pick a perspective, and you can't just let this descend into partisan politics, you know, because we are trying to get our governments to stop the arms and so on, to answer those very real questions. You know, I really think we need to tap into what a lot of people are calling people power. Communities building your campaigns at the community level, and not sort of a recipe from the center or from the national level or what have you. And I think you get a real kind of richness and creativity that happens that way. Again, you need multiple people involved in these things. I think, you know, a lot of what's been said today is around language and how it easily descends into being dehumanizing in order to get that initial attention. And to really, you know, it's that sort of race to be the worst. This is the most important because, and they list a bunch of stuff that ultimately is a terrible way to describe what's going on and not respectful of the people involved. And we need to lean more into the interconnectedness between crises. You know, I sort of hammer the media a fair bit, and there's good reasons for that. You know, and we need to be better at how we tell our stories as well. You know, it's Amnesty's done some extremely good research on who is supplying the arms to the conflict in Sudan, both sides, if you want to call them sides, all the parties, because yeah, it isn't this. So that's not the right. It's a power struggle, and you know. But when do we get a call? We get a call when some Canadian rifles are found in the hands of the RSF. You know, and don't get me wrong, anytime weapons are in a conflict zone where war crimes, crimes against humanity, atrocities are happening, you need to investigate how those got there. Particularly because there is a UN embargo on Darfur. There has been for decades. We want that expanded to all of Sudan. Canada has sanctions. So how did they get there? But that's the only story we're hearing. We've been trying to tell a story for years about, you know, China is selling to every party in this conflict. That's kind of unusual. Usually a state backs one party or another. It's just that, you know, enabling of a chronic conflict. But yeah, what people hear and what they then fixate on ultimately sort of undermines some of the advocacy we're doing. And we need to figure out how to, I wanted to end on a more positive note. Hang on. Okay, I'll take it. It just, yeah, I'll end on this one. And that is that, because we struggle with so much, right? But we need to stay grounded in universality. I think when someone is asking you to accept human rights violations or is appealing for balance, you know, all of the alarms should be going off. All the red flags should be going up for you. And to continue to focus on the fact that genuine security is only going to be achieved by pursuing human rights for everyone.
Thank you. We'll turn now to online, Lindsay, to share with us your remarks on strategies, actions, priorities.
Thanks so much. I mean, the conversation has been so rich, and so those are a lot of really difficult interventions to follow. Maybe I just actually wanted to reflect from my experience the last month during Women, Peace and Security Month at the UN headquarters. Is like, it's been such a flurry of events. And I think there was a lot of anxiety going into Women, Peace and Security Month. I don't know how closely many of you follow the Security Council dynamics, but Russia held the presidency for the open debate this year on women, peace, and security. And there was a lot of talk in advance of, that this could be a massive setback for the agenda and how to mitigate some of those risks. And I think what we found in the end was a lot of what you were saying is that actually women's voices from the field, if I've seen one thing over the last 15 years of my career working in different organizations at different country levels to regional offices now to headquarters, is like, I do think women's voices are coming through more than ever. And the reason I say that is because, there were over 50 side events organized during Women, Peace, and Security Week at headquarters. And maybe 10 years ago, there would have been like a handful of events on this topic. There were over like 100 news publications that actually had very specific articles on women, peace, and security. So trying to pick up on maybe some of the positive, I do think this agenda has managed to break through. But I think where we're still faltering a lot is turning this rhetoric into realities for women in their communities on the ground in conflict, because the rhetoric is not being matched by the resources that they require. And as many of you have rightly said, is like, they have the solutions. This is not a question of like needing to reinvent the wheel. These women know what is necessary in their communities. These women and girls are living this reality every day, and they are doing miraculous things with almost zero resources. So I think really the next, there was a lot of requests to kind of like think about the next 25 years of the women, peace, and security agenda. And I really think what we need to try to think about is like, how do we better capture the resources that are out there and make sure that they're reaching the women on the front lines that are really doing this work? Because I think that's where we're still languishing in terms of implementation. I think we have frameworks, we have rhetoric, we have, a lot of countries making political declarations that are very strong. And there's more and more diversity also in terms of those countries that are joining on to this agenda. But I think turning that then into more peaceful communities and environments in countries is where we're really struggling. So I don't know if that's that hopeful, but I just think it's really about trying to capitalize. There's money to go around in this world, and we see that now that member states are jumping at increasing their military spending by 2%. They're finding resources to do that, and it doesn't seem to be a problem with that. So if I think it's really comes down to political will, and we need to galvanize that political will together. Thanks
Much, Lindsay, and appreciate you highlighting some of the successes, because we have to also recognize those successes and see how we can build those successes. I want to turn it now to questions, discussions, reflections, and I want all of you to participate in some way. And I know not everyone will have a chance in the time that we have to ask a question, but one way to do it is to make a reflection, a comment. Is there a word, an idea, or context, a case study that you wanted to add to the discussion? And if you don't have it, I want all of you to make a little note on these little cards, and we can hang them on the tree afterwards. But we're going to take 2 questions from the room. Nanny has a microphone, so she'll come around. Please do ask your question into the mic. We have several people online who are listening in, and we want them to be able to hear. So 2 people in the room, and then we'll take a comment from online or a question from online as well. We'll take maybe we'll take a bunch, maybe take a few notes about the things that the panelists would like to respond to, and then we'll come back to the panelists to give short 1 to 2 minute responses to what we're hearing in the room. All right, so who has comments, reflections, additions, insights, ideas that they want to share? Great. We have Jenna. Nanny, right in front of you. I saw Jenna first, and then maybe we'll go to Maddie. And I'm sorry, I don't see your name, but we'll come to you. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much to everybody. This was very interesting to listen to. My question kind of ties back to what Lindsay was just saying about the UN Security Council and the WPS framework. A few years ago, I was writing about the two most recent resolutions that did a lot of work to backtrack the agenda and in fact sort of undermine it through the Security Council itself. And we're seeing the Security Council and the UN more broadly losing legitimacy, being fragmented, failing to address any sort of these forgotten crises. But there is a lot of this work is being done on the ground. A lot of this stuff is happening without these agendas at the international level. But as you've all also pointed out, you do need sort of those voices and those power brokers to still hold up these ideas. And so the kind of not collapsing of the agenda alongside sort of the fragmentation of the UN at this international level, but also global backlash against women's rights with, countries pulling out of big women's rights treaties, sort of just a general backlash against women's rights. How are all these things? I don't know if it's quite, I'm trying to struggle to formulate this question quite as a question, but sort of how are these two sort of things happening in tension, and what is the impact of this sort of this collapse in the international level on sort of other than funding, which we all know is being pulled, but what are the implications on sort of women's work on the ground and all of the civil society work that's happening?
Hi, my name is Maddie. I'm a PhD student here. Thank you all so much. A lot of you mentioned the growing militarization and increases in defense spending, massive increases in defense spending with a shrinking space for peace building and civil society. But I wanted to ask about the militarization of like the actual WPS agenda and arguments that it improves operational effectiveness. And yeah, like how do we square those tensions? Does that concern you at all? And is there still space for using WPS as a frame for anti-militarization in that context?
We'll come to Callum now. He's got a question from online that he'll read.
Yep, and from Yodi Tamuru, it has been 25 years since Resolution 1325 was adopted, yet meaningful progress remains limited. Dialogues have been held in various forums and produced little tangible change beyond rhetorical commitments. This underscores the need for genuine inclusion of women in peacebuilding processes. Could you please share with us a feasible strategy to address this challenge?
All right, we have a job ahead of us. One last question, please introduce yourself briefly.
Yes, hi. Sorry, my name's Madison. I'm a grad student here with the Public School and International Affairs at U Ottawa. Thank you so much for providing all your insight and all of your hard work. It's super appreciated, and it was very insightful to hear from you. I guess my question kind of goes off a bit of what Lindsay said at the end about how we also need to celebrate success, right? And Canada back in I think it was 2017, we developed our own feminist international foreign policy. But this also kind of falls in line with the previous discussion too, that a lot of the rhetoric or the way that we frame these things and the conversations we have don't actually solve the people that they're intended to, right? So I guess my question is, how effective do you feel that the FIAP has been in solving these issues or being involved in any of the work that you are doing? This also comes out of personal beliefs that I feel like it's not very touched upon a lot, and I haven't heard from it in a really long time. So thank you.
Thank you. So we have 4 comments and questions, and maybe we can take a moment now to hear from our panelists, and we'll come back. I think we'll have time as lunch is still being set up. We have time. We can ask for another round of questions after. Who wants to start? Fahima, would you like to start?
I'm sorry, I'm not very optimistic when it comes to working with women, peace and security, with the UN Security Council, and all this, a lot of things. But there's no funding for it. The governments are not r- really obligated to implement the national plans. I find it very difficult for women organization or the women's movement in any, especially in countries where they really in desperate need to implement 1325, for example, that you come and that's, yeah, then a lot of money was put into the national plan. Women were being asked and all over the country and the plan is here, but it's on the table, doesn't go anywhere. So I think we need to say that, and we need to say that is not the right way unless we have really allocated budget for implementation of 1325 of every country who will do the national action plan to do it, and it has to be really monitored. But just having a document, we had I mean, when I was working back in Sudan, I think 3 action plan were there until the last one that was made in 2022. They're all there. I have them in my desktop. They don't do anything. I'm sorry to say that. But yeah, a lot of work need to be done. I mean, issues of compensation, for example, issues of economical empowerment, issues of recognition of women, I mean, of issues of accountability and it's not happening on the ground. And then people will go in October every year to meet for the week of the Security Council looking at women, peace and security. I've been there once, but that's why I'm not very really feeling that that will really make an impact unless there is a lot of pressure and there is contribution from women movements in the global south or women from all over who are really concerned about issues of women, peace and security, to have more clear, voice in the Security Council to say this cannot be implemented unless we have 1, 2, 3. But just to have it 1325, how many declare? I think so many came to actually strengthen 1325 itself. How much has been 10 years? More than 10 years. It's now 25 years. Every year they will issue something else, 1820, I don't know what, and then we strengthen that, and then are they change really the reality of women who are really facing sexual violence in conflict?
These
I mean,
are,
I don't see it.
yeah, thank you. Those are important reflections. Let's hear from a few others.
I'll take the FIAP one maybe later, but if others want to answer the other question.
I want to touch upon the question about the militarization and then WPS and how do women engage. So as somebody who worked with NATO and Afghan forces, particularly in Afghanistan, we had this tension and still have. But at the same time, it's also very scary to let them do what they want to do, right? So we have to find ways to make that influence. And also we have seen that when we tried to engage, for example, I remember 2008 when we went to the NATO and brought the women's voices into the stability plans that they were making for the provinces. So then they said, okay, we don't know what to do about it. So then somebody said, oh, they might have gender advisors. So we engaged with some of their gender advisors, and it was so interesting that the gender advisors told us, thank God you guys came. We had nothing to do literally for, so many years sitting in these compounds because they are not using of us at all. So, and then we started kind of making them look at the stability, look at the peace part, look at the community part. You're talking about reintegration. What about the family's reintegration? You're talking about, for example, mediating conflicts. Then how about like why women are not, part of this? So it's a double-edged sword at times, and we were also labeled, oh, these people are part of NATO, they are puppets of, Western forces, and that makes us, vulnerable at times as well. But at the same time, I'm also kind of very much reluctant to let them do what they want to do, and things get worse, right? And the other point I also want to mention in terms of particularly feminist international assistance policy and some of these international rhetoric, despite the fact that I think it's being used as a strategy to keep pushing for cultural relativism, to let people do their own things, because yes, these international concepts, WPS agenda, feminist international assistance policy, WPS lens, all of them, they have been weakened. There's no doubt. There's a lot of backlash, funding cuts and all of that. But I also see that many people are using this as a strategy to tell us, oh, your strategies are not working. Oh, you're talking about WPS, it's not working. You're talking about feminist leadership, it's not working. Let people come up with their own indigenous way of, thinking. And then what happens? That commitment fades away. So the governments in the states particularly who can be, and because they are not binding, they continue to actually, this cultural relativism. Oh, in Afghanistan, this is their culture. Girls don't go to school. So let them be like that. Women don't go to politics. While they have, they don't see that this is actually a deliberate action to remove, women from those spaces. So I also think it's important to have these international policies, these frameworks, but of course, how do we make sure that, we monitor that and holding them accountable? And the last point I also want to say, as like engaging with the regional, for example, in Kitchener-Waterloo that I live, I've been engaging a lot with our counselors. I also find how much, we forget to engage politically. And at times, we also kind of let politicians come up with their own rhetoric because we have given up on them. When, for example, a premier gets only 20% of votes, that's very bad in a country which is like democratic, right? Why not everybody, or at least more than 50% of the society comes and votes? So the political accountability is also key, especially for countries like Canada, for example, which is democratic, and we need to hold our politicians accountable, not co-opting to it what's changing, because that's very scary. Thank you.
Thanks. I didn't know if others wanted to go in order. So yeah, happy to speak to the FIAP question. Thank you for asking that. So I work predominantly in programming, so I see the FIAP in action all of the time. And what I would say is the FIAP, the Feminist International Assistance Policy, is it perfect? No. Are there lots of critiques of it? Yes. But have I seen the effectiveness of it? Absolutely yes. So I've been working on programming before and since the FIAP came into place. And what I can say is it has changed the way that we have designed and implemented and measured results within programming. So what I would say is let me give you an example. So for the project that I referenced called the Changes Project in Somalia, that project was very unique in Somalia, that it was focusing on the prevention of, like I said, child early and forced marriage and FGMC through the lens of girls' empowerment and rights. Oftentimes, that type of programming is through the lens of child protection. Child protection, while it's very important, it's not necessarily putting the rights and voices of girls at the center. So what we had seen was that even my colleagues in the country would say, this is a unique project that we have in Somalia that we've never seen before among Save the Children or other INGOs that are working there. And by the way, before I joined the INGO world, I used to work with feminist and women's rights organizations that were much more, feminist. But having the FIAP helps me have those conversations within the INGO world with colleagues who may not come from that same background of women and girls' rights and feminism. So it's helped shift the needle even internally with my colleagues in Canada, but also globally around what is it that we're actually trying to achieve and why. So the FIAP for me has helped shift, like my colleague here said, is it perfect? No, but having that framework can help move things along. So in a way of how you talk about things, how you engage in topics. And for me also, what I was going to say is even within Save the Children, which typically hasn't been as strong on gender equality, maybe compared to other organizations or peers, the FIAP has really helped Save the Children Canada lead within the Save the Children movement in terms of the conversations and what we're able to do and shift. And also, I think what the FIAP does is that it helped us in the way of, oh, sorry, I completely lost my train of thought. Thank you, germs and cold. What was I going to say? The way we do things, what I was going to say is the FIAP has helped us that gender equality and the rights of women and girls, or their empowerment, has moved. It has helped shift the needle. Let me say that. Maybe not completely moved, but has helped shift the needle among putting that at the center. So before, you would see a lot of what's called gender mainstreaming. So the add-on, the don't forget about this, but you don't really have to do it, but it's kind of there, but it's not always meaningful. Whereas the FIAP has said, the rights of women and girls, gender equality and the empowerment are objectives and outcomes in and of themselves, regardless of what the outcome area is. So whether you're working in education, whether you're working in health, whether that be sexual reproductive health or nutrition, whether you're working in livelihoods, women's economic justice, they're saying that their empowerment and rights are objectives. Yes, we will probably also see improvements in SRHR, nutrition, education, whereas before it was seen as a means to have outcomes and changes in other outcome areas. So for me, I think the FIAP has brought a lot. It's going to be really sad to see if it goes. I will be very sad to see if it goes because, like I said, it's not perfect. And I know that Global Affairs has been having a hard time or been critiqued that it hasn't worked, but we submit reports yearly showing that it does. Perhaps it's just maybe an internal problem on their side for demonstrating those results and taking everything up, especially if you don't have general indicators for measurement. But I have absolutely seen in practice with my own eyes that it has been effective in different ways. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. The first question is Jenna. Yes. You talk about, this collapsing of the women, peace, and security agenda with what's happening in the world. So first of all, I'm going to say two bad words, Elon Musk. And the reason I say that is because if we were able to connect with someone that had that type of money, we wouldn't have a problem right now in being able to fund the things that we need to, right? And the reason I mentioned those two bad words was because one of the things that we've touched upon a little bit today, Fahima had talked about it a little bit, is like, well, a lot bit, but is what something missing in the conversation is men, right? And what's happening, there's two things that are happening with the men. One is that there is insane toxicity right now. Like, I don't know I do know what's going on, but it is insane to see what's happening with men right now and how they're feeling isolated, especially like generations who don't remember when their, I guess, grandmothers didn't have credit cards. Like, they're just like, those boys and men are thinking like, what about me, right? What is my identity if I am not whatever the stereotype is, right? And in not bringing them along, we are not only losing a partner that's necessary in establishing and sustaining women's and girls' rights, it's clawing things back. So when we talk about this collapse, that's part of the problem, right? Is that toxicity and also like not the lack of acknowledgement of how patriarchy has impacted all genders, not just a female gender, all genders, and which means like one of the things that we're not really talking about here as well as queer people who identify as 2S, two-spirited. So I would say that's kind of like what's going on there. The other thing I would say, I keep thinking as I'm sitting here with all of you folks, that some of you folks are in university right now and are thinking like, what did you guys do? Like, I'm gonna fix this because like it's just, what'd you do? and to that, I think to myself, I had the same thoughts when I was coming out of university and going like, how can we be moving so slowly, and in some ways, how can we be moving backwards? And that's a fair question to ask. Like, if anything, like I kind of sit here with all like, I've got about over 20 years of doing this. There are some in the room who've done it for even longer. And I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, here you go. Like, and so to that point, I want to come to Madison's question about FIAP. And I want to say, like, the first thing I would say is what I said about the first Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. What was good about it? It exists. That was it. It is a starting point, because one of the things that we're dealing with is people not even being comfortable to have those conversations. So the National Action Plan, the FIAP, these created vocabulary to make it a little more okay to talk about this stuff, and to normalize that this is actually something we need to be talking about because it impacts humanity, right? Because women create the next generation. So it matters. It really matters. So I understand the frustration. I share it as well. And this is also why you have activists who are like wanting to throw, Fahima was like, I don't have a lot of hope. Yeah, you want to throw your hands up in the air and go, are you kidding me after all these years? And yet there's that idea, like, can we think about 7 generations in the future? I know it's not, doesn't make me feel good. I want to solve the problem right now. I want people to stop dying needlessly right now. So the answer I'm giving you will not make any of us feel better, but these are movements forward, and the way that we retract and move backward, and I'm going to come back to this because I think it needs to be said again and again, is if we go, yes, but. If you hear a yes, but, that is a red flag for you that we are going backwards, or that we're not helping the situation, and it will contribute to girls, to women, to many people dying needlessly. Caleb, you asked about how 25 years and little has changed. And I think I want to also say to you, yeah, on some level, I want to say, yeah, little has changed. And I would also say, as someone who's actively been working on this for over 20 years, it feels a little defeatist to go man, I guess I just didn't do that much in those years. And even though sometimes I feel like I'm not doing enough and that nothing I'm doing matters, one of the things that my Indigenous colleagues reminds me of, we always have this particular circle conversation in the car when we're going to do work. And I say everything just sucks and we're all going to die. And he says to me, he says, Joe, I'm in a better place than my father was. He's an Indigenous man. And he says to me, I'm in a better place than my father. And it's that makes me go, okay, fine. Let's we need to keep going, right? It's progress, not perfection. It's learning from the failures. It's moving ahead in spite of, especially when there are people, again, who have nothing to lose, who are fighting regardless. I wake up in the morning, I'm like, I'm doing this fight along with these people, even if I'm I don't know, is it making any difference? So I think it is a good thing that we have FIAP. Is it effective? No. Can we do more? Yes. Let's do more. Thank you.
I think so much I could say about the UN Security Council. I think it has been really disheartening recently to see the international human rights system be so easily picked up, unpicked. And if you spent your career in that area, yeah, you can be really, really down. But you have to get back up. I think, we need to reward persistence. We need to, have our moments of regrouping and have our community we can work with and keep moving forward, because there has been progress, and sometimes that is very, very hard to see. I was sitting here as you were speaking, thinking, if this panel was 25 years ago, it would have been 3 white men. There has been some progress. We can't take it for granted. and we need to protect it and move forward, but there has been progress. And, you know, having said that, like the UN Security Council is the number one reason we don't have an arms embargo on all of Sudan. The two big arms dealers in that context are Russia and China, two of the biggest. But we can't just sort of go, damn, like the UN Security Council, we can't fix it. We have to keep trying to figure out how to do that. And, you know, and recognize that some of the problems are inside the house. You know, if you follow the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, you'll know that do they really support gender rights? Go look it up. That's part of the problem. These mechanisms have become very politicized. Like the same problem I was talking about with the Standing Committee on International Human Rights exists like writ large. And you know, you were asking what is the impact on the ground when you see rollback, when you see people stepping out of treaties, whether it's the Rome Statute or Istanbul, and so on. And it makes things much more dangerous on the ground for human rights defenders. And if you're a woman human rights defender, it's way more dangerous. So it does mean you need to help lift up the organizations that do that solidarity work becomes even more important. If it isn't part of what you're doing now, you need to think about is it part of what you should be doing and who can you be working with? And the Canadian government does have the Voices at Risk guidelines. They've talked a long time about revising those and making sure more diplomatic missions are using them more consistently. We need to keep leaning on our government to do that and put it in the context of conversations like, I mean, the feminist international foreign policy, like we have a feminist international assistance policy. Do we really have I defy you to show me the document that says the foreign policy, because assistance and foreign, not the same thing. And they get so conflated, and that is also part of the problem. But the note I want to end on is, part of what kind of lifted me up around, because I do a lot of work on Gaza, was that it was South Africa that took Israel to court. It's a global South, and the global majority. I think language, man, it evolves. We need to keep moving with it and be very mindful of it. But yeah, it's like those attitudes around yes, we want Canada to act, but look what South Africa has led. Look who else is leading those initiatives, and to question what we have thought of as where power is. I mean, when you keep acknowledging power being in a particular place, of course it stays there and it stays very powerful. When you shake that up, it makes a difference. Yes, right now, those are the members of the UN Security Council, the permanent members. We can't believe it will always be that way. We have to keep working.
Lindsay, if you're still with us, did you want to add a few comments and remarks?
Yeah, I'm still here. Sure, I will try to add a little bit of food for thought. Those are some tough questions, but maybe one thing I just wanted to share is where I've seen opportunity, or where I see opportunity going forward. And I think translating these frameworks, national action plans, for example, very concrete, like someone said earlier, we have great recommendations, we have great reports, we have great all these things. So how do we translate those things? And I think one of the things that we need to think about is those national action plans. We travel a lot speaking to ministers of gender, ministers of women in affairs. They're often loaded with these national frameworks they have to implement. And then we ask them what budgets do you have to do this? They have no budgets. They're chasing around their other ministerial colleagues, trying to get them to care about these issues. And in some cases, I've gone back to other conflict affected countries and I've seen those ministers move portfolios, and all of a sudden, the minister of gender is now the minister of finance or the minister of defense, and having women in political positions, which, we started to kind of talk about. And I think that's a big part of the Women, Peace and Security pillar, is thinking about putting women in not just positions like ministries of gender or as gender advisors. Of course, we need we need experts in those areas too, but like encouraging feminists to look at becoming the Minister of Defense, look at becoming the Minister of Gender, look at becoming ambassadors for their country who sit on the UN Security Council. I really do think that makes a big difference. And I can even say from my own lived experience working in peace operations for a number of years, going from being a gender advisor to a senior women protection advisor, and like really having mandates that focus on women's rights, gender equality, how that can feel like such an uphill battle at times that's under-resourced. I think one of the most impactful jobs I ever had was after many years of being in the DRC, when I actually managed to then become a trust fund manager, and I was like managing a multi-million-dollar trust fund. After all that years of gender experience, all of those feminist networks that I worked with, I finally held the purse strings, and I actually could help shape and influence decisions of who was getting funding. So no longer was it a question of me having to, you know, bang on and make an argument that at least 15 to 30% of the money that we had should go to these organizations. I was signing off on that, and I could influence that in a really meaningful way. So I do think about that a lot. As like I think as feminists, we should encourage each other to go into other parts of politics, of government, keeping our feminist hat on and keeping this agenda strong. But I think we could be influential if we're, you know, in other parts of the system.
Thank you so much. There's lots of really great insights there. There are a few other strategies and opportunities. I just want to point one out. Today, feel free to join us. The Canadian Civil Society Working Group on Sudan is meeting from 1 to 3 to step 1 floor in room 5027 to plan some additional strategies and advocacy work. There's a meeting with the parliamentarians on November 19th. So there's some really great solidarity work that's ongoing. We want to have time for lunch as well. We have this room just until 1 o'clock. So let's continue the conversations over our lunch. Thank you to those of you who joined online. I appreciate you joining us. Thank you especially to our speakers today. Join me in thanking them.